Let's start by making up our webbing strap. We're going to cover our piece of webbing. It's just a cotton webbing. It's about 3 centimeters or 1.25 inches wide. And we're going to cover it with our self-matching fabric, which is within the tote. And we're just going to attach the edge of our fabric to the edge of our webbing, so right side up. And we've got a seam allowance at each end of our piece of fabric for us to do the turnout. So we want to turn out the ends, so we want to wrap this piece of webbing with our fabric and then have some neat turned out edges. A little bit of a different way of doing it, but it works out very, very well. So what we're going to do is we're going to enclose the webbing inside a piece of the fabric there, and the fabric is turned and so it's just inside out almost. So you can see that there, the webbing is enclosed. But let's just make it a little bit more simple. Undo that, roll that edge out, and then just within the seam allowance at the end, just stitch that fabric within the seam allowance. Do that on both ends. Just makes for a tighter end, a neater finish. Not catching the webbing at this stage. So we're going to roll that so as that the other edge is in line with the edge of the webbing, and stitch along the edge, just catching the very, very edge of the webbing. As you can see, when it's turned out, nice neat finish, then we turn it out again. So there we are, so that's sitting inside our fabric. Let's just turn it through our first layer. Okay. And then let's just turn it through one more time, and that end is then bagged out. You might need to nudge those corners out slightly with the end of, with either a point turner, or I'm just using the blunt end of my scissors. Right, so that's nice and neat, and just roll that edge in so as it's parallel with the first turned edge. Put some clips on, and we're going to top stitch this into position just to give it a little bit of detail. I've used the Japanese fabrics on this tote there, so I want it to look like a bit like a judo belt, so it's got rows of stitching through it. So edge stitch around the edge first. My foot rocked, so I just popped the needle pack underneath the back of my foot so as that it actually took off neatly without hesitating on our corners. Bit like a humper jumper with your machine, or you could use a piece of folded fabric, but I find that quite handy. Now I'm just top stitching inside from the edge stitching, just 1/4 inch in. Done. Right, let's start with our lid, and we're going to join the two sections to the front and the back of the lid. So let's put some clips in, ready for us to stitch these seams. So that's one. You got to look at that edge border flip and fold seam just to make sure that we actually get that so as it runs together properly and it matches. So let's sew those two seams. So, and I like to look for them seam on seam at the top and down the bottom, where we're sewing just inside the perimeter stitching line. And then just open that up and just make sure that we have got that as being a perfect join. There we go. Great. That's sewing along. And we'll just open that seam up. We'll press that seam open shortly. So we've pressed that, and we've pressed that one there. So now, let's get rid of those two pieces. We want to do our center seam. This center seam is where our handle is going to go onto as well. So let's match the center at the center seam, and let's match the ends as well. And we're just going to sew the seam with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and making sure that we match our stripes. So there we have, we've sewn that, and then we need to open that up with the iron. Just make sure that intersection is nice and accurate. Open that up. Right, let's move on to doing the sewing the panel seams, so as we can cut our lining more so than anything. So we're just going to do, so we've got our one side of our tray, the base of our tray, and the remaining side of our tray, and we want to join those like we just have with the lid. Now you can see that that top seam allowance is a little bit more, it shows you a little bit more than the bottom, and that's so as that there's no batting or stabilizer in there, so as that when we put our zip on, it's not binding. We're going to attach our linings to our end sections of our lid. Then, this is our lid, and we're going to just walk that round. That's how that's going to go onto there. But first of all, we need to find our centre mark around our crescent seam, our curve seam, because that centre mark is very, very important, because we need to actually make sure that that seam sews onto it. But before we put our ends on, it's easier to put our handle on, and I've set my handle so they're just inside that first seam, and we're going to sew just a square on, and we're going to sew a straight line at either that side of the D-ring. You can do it how you wish. You don't have to do it the way we have. As you can see them there, there's some square top stitching on our handle. Now we're going to match our panel seam, our border seam of these blocks, and I will do that on both sides, on both ends first, before snipping and cutting and doing that curved seam. It's easier to get those borders matched for the first couple of inches of stitching. It's better to get that match there, and then let's match the other one. It's easier to do this than it is to try and start and sew all the way around and then get to the end and we find that we cannot match that border flip and fold panel. So let's do those and get those in position first. We're doing both ends. Right. Okay, so that's matched and that's matched. Let's do the other end. We've got our centre on centre. So let's turn this through. Just check to make sure that everything is matching nicely. We want to do the other end before we do our curve seam. So okay, that's what we've got here. Now, you can either put a pin at the top of your centre seam there, or just tack it like we just have for those end borders. You can just put a little bit of machine tack, and I'm clipping in to the joined panel seams, not the curve end of the lid. We want to snip into the panel seams, and it's every 1/2 inch. Okay, so this is released, not the curve seam on the ends. It's the joined panels of the lid. So pin or use some quilt clips. Okay, that's in the end there. Let's do the other side. I might have been a little bit generous and not cut. Keep those edges even. When we stitch this, we want to be stitching so as the seams are stitching on top of each other, so we can't see any stitching from the right side. Okay, now the reason why we've put the lining on those end panels and we're going to stitch it in this position is that we're going to put our last piece of lining, which is the full length of the lid, on at our next stage, and that stops it from dropping down into the tote when the tote is opened. Otherwise, if the lid lining is free, it naturally will want to actually drop down. So having this caught in the seam is really important. So we're just stitching around the edge of here, and we're using a zip foot so as we can get nice and close to our stitching. We're using the perimeter stitching line that we have on the end of our blocks to actually be a guide for our seam allowance, and it just goes in really, really easily. If you're taking the right seam allowance and have trimmed exactly on your 1/2 inch seams, you will find that the seam fits absolutely perfectly. Having those ends done at the beginning really helps. There we go. So, now with our lining, we're going to stitch this on now as well. So we're going to reverse it onto itself. But first of all, we need to find the halfway mark in our seam. Exactly like we did with the end panels, just clip. So that half mark goes onto the seam mark, and then we just want to snip in 3/8 if that along that edge. Snip, snip, snip. The lining is a bit more flexible than the actual joint panels. Then let's put our centre onto centre first. And just clip them all the way around with our quilt clips. Okay, so when that's sewn and pulled back, see how that envelopes that seam. Okay, so it's actually caught in between all the layers. Right, now let's just sew this on again, zip foot, standard length, stitch length, and we're sewing on top of our original stitching line. Take it in sections if you like. Don't hurry with it. It will all happen, it will all work. I fiddle and rearrange and make sure that my seam's feeling as straight as possible. When stitching a curve, you're trying to make the curve seem a little bit straight in front of the foot so as it actually sews better. It's a very hard thing to explain, it's more of a visual. You're trying to keep the seam quite straight. My centre has shifted. I think my clip came out. Right, there we go. On retrospect, I probably would have been better to actually stitch my lining at the beginning and at the end of that seam like we did it originally, and then we'll be able to ease it in all the way through. It should fit nicely. You might have 1/8 of an inch hanging over the end. Possibly, possibly not. It doesn't really matter. The lining will still be full inside the lid. Okay, so that's sandwiched that seam. So the seam is pushing back on itself. Do the other end. That's how the lining will look when they've both been sewn, and we'll just turn them through. Then we want to just catch the edge of the lining around the perimeter of that lid seam where the zip's going to end up being. But that lining will not fall down. Turn through to the wrong side, and then we're just going to go around the edge, keep that even, and stitch that seam using the original perimeter stitching line again. Just stitch to the right hand side of that line. This is basically to keep it in place. Now, let's look at the base. So we've attached our first seam, our first side panel onto our base. The base is the 2 black seams. But we have stopped short of we have stopped on our seam allowance line so as that We're not going to go the very edge of the end of the seam allowance. We're going on to, we're stitching right up to the end point. We're starting in on that point, and then we're finishing on that point. So that corner seam allowance is free. If you're one stitch over, it's fine. We need to match that central panel intersection. If you're one stitch over, that's fine, but don't be short. You do not want to carry your stitching all the way into that seam allowance. That corner needs to be free. Okay, so those are our two sides. Now we're going to put an end panel on. Okay. If you look at the seam allowances around the edge of the blocks, the wider seam allowance, it's not a seam allowance, it just doesn't have any batting or bag stabilizer inside it, so as that the zip is easier to put in. Now we're sewing to the net, that means we're sewing to that corner point. Okay, so there's our end in. Those corners need to be free. We're going to press our seams once we've got our other end on. Okay, so there's our box. We just got to do the last corner seams. So let's just put a clip on the top of each of those. That base, that bottom seam that's onto our base, all those seam intersections, all those seams are still free. We've stopped at that point. Very important that they are free. Otherwise, this will not turn out neatly. So let's go. We're going to start sewing from the top, the opening end. And it's again at seam on seam, stitching line on stitching line, sewing on the perimeter stitching line or just inside of. And fold that bottom block, fold it on diagonal so you can see where all your intersections end. See, I've pulled those seam allowances down so I can see where my last stitch is going to be. So they're down on the front and down on the back. Okay, so they're not caught. When they turn through, it gives you a nice sharp point. Again, starting at the top, we've folded that block at the bottom onto a 45° and pulling our seam allowances down so as they're out of the way of the needle so they can't be caught. And I'm just checking to make sure that my stitches are sitting on top of each other when I'm sewing this panel, because I don't want any stitches showing on the outside. There we go. They're nice and clean. Okay. Then we just got the other end to do. Right. Now we've cut our lining. We cut our lining from the shapes when we joined our panels for our outside blocks. So we're going to do the same. We've got our first side panel, and we're going to put just a slip-in pocket onto this panel, and I've just folded that and made a crease down the middle so I can see where the middle of this pocket is. And I'm going to sew just press a foot width within the seam allowance and sew up to my crease. So one side of it, reverse a few stitches, sew down again into our seam allowance. This pocket will seem to be just a fraction long for some reason, so just trim that off. Right, so that's our pocket. So let's put our first pocket onto our base section, starting in from our seam allowance in. We do not want to be sewing all the way out to the very raw edge. When making a lining, you could take a slightly bigger seam allowance. So the seams are 1/2 inch seams, so you could take 5/8 seams just making the lining a little bit smaller to sit inside the box. It won't look quite so alive. So it would be 5/8 seams for all of these seams putting this together. Just makes the lining a fraction smaller, because otherwise it sits with some little bit of excess inside the tote, which we don't really want. Right. And we're going to do the same thing with our, pull that back so as we can see where our corner point is. And sewing from our corner point to corner point to attach the end panel of our tray. When we sew to points, we call it sewing to the net, meaning that it does not encompass the seam allowance. Okay, that's one. Okay, all those seam allowances are free. And our last one. Doesn't matter whether you sew with the base of this up or the base of it down. It doesn't matter as long as you're consistent and as long as you don't catch those seams and as long as the seams all fit. Yeah, it doesn't matter which way you do it. Right. Now we need to sew our corners all together. I've got one little stitch which is just hanging over there. Sew to the net. Please, by all means, use pins and clips. For those of you who've seen my videos before, you realise that I actually don't use pins and clips when I'm sewing. I like to get it done. Not so for any other reason than I've been a machinist for so many years and still love it. So there we go. We've got our inside lining with our pockets both sides. 1, 2, 3, 4. And we're just going to slip this inside. You could give it a little bit of press. You can open those seams up on the corners if you like. We're just going to sit that lining. It's best to actually turn the outside joined panels inside out and slip it inside the lining. It's actually a little bit easier to sew. Use our quilt clips to catch our corners, seam on seam, seam on seam, and seam on seam, and then we'll just put a clip in at our halfway point along our sides. The reason why I turned it out so is that you'll see when we go to the machine, we have a row of stitches we can follow to attach the lining at the top edge of where the zip's going to be. And we've got one more there. Make sure it's even. Voila, we're going to stitch that around the edge using the perimeter stitching line as our guide. Start at the corner and just work your way around. I'm just sewing on that straight row of stitching, which is our perimeter stitching. And that will leave us with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. If you're using a number 5 zip, then you're going to use that 1/2 inch seam allowance quite happily to attach your zip. But if you're going to use a number 3 zip, seam allowance is actually only, the zip tape is only 1 centimetre wide or 3/8 wide. So we're going to have to put a row of or probably a guideline row, which I usually put a row of stitching 1/4 inch in from that raw edge. So as I line my zip up with the edge of that row of stitching, so as that when the zip's sewn in, we don't see our top row of stitching, which we're stitching on now, that's actually hidden underneath the zip stitching. So if you were going to be using a number 5 zip, which is a bit chunkier, you would use the whole 1/2 inch seam allowance that we're actually using here without the need of actually setting the zip back at all. But you'll see what I'm talking about with this when we come up to it. Right, there is our tray. So we have a lid and a tray for this bag. Okay, let's measure. So fold it in half, point to point. Let's measure to see what sort of zip. So I said it was going to be about 30 inches for this particular bag, because I was using the, I think it was the 5x5s block, but it ended up being 29.5. So we've measured our zip, cut our continuous zip. We've got 2 runners on it, just going to the middle, but we need to cut a piece of fabric which is 3 times the width of our finished zip tape. Fold on the edges fold in the edges 1/2 inch, and then again fold it in half, and we're just going to stitch with a 1/2 inch seam to make a loop which we can thread onto the zip tape, which will cover our join at the back of our tote. We don't want to see the join. So we're just covering it up, hiding it. So this little loop, we should be able to slide our zip through that loop once it's actually turned through to the right side. Let's just flatten that down and finger press our seam open. Turn it through, and then we will be able to slide that onto our zip. Okay, so it's a nice snug fit. We don't want it bigger and we don't want it too small. We want it to be exactly the right size, so you might need to actually redo that seam. And then just line the zips up and I'm just going to zigzag them together for 2 reasons. I don't want, I'm zigzagging them just to keep those together. I don't want the zip teeth to come undone. I want them to stay closed. And then that's a bit frail, so I'm just going to stitch on the zip tape itself just with a straight stitch 2 or 3, 4, 5 times, both sides. I mean, so it's not the most pretty looking finish. You're not going to see it though, because it's going to be covered by our loop or our sleeve. It's a sleeve of fabric which is going to just be pulled along. There we are, hidden. Half and half, just put a row of tacking stitches, so that's our centre back seam, that's our half. Fold it on those tacking stitches, fold, 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 and then put a pin in to represent our centre front of our zip. So the centre front. So just pin it and just check you've got the right distance. Yep, that looks good. If you're using a number 5 zip, you'd actually put these edges together now, so they would be butted together. But we're using a number 3, so we need to actually put an extra row of stitching just in 1/4 inch, where we're going to actually, and we just do that by machine. Okay, I'm just stitching in 1/4 inch from the raw edge. It's just a guideline seam, nothing more. It's only an extra row of stitching that is nice and even, which we can put the edge of our zip tape to to pin it to it so as it's slightly stepped before we sew our zip in, if we use it, because our zip tape is not as wide as the heavier duty zip. I just didn't want you to be trimming all your blocks down to 3/8. I just wanted to keep it consistent with 1/2 inch as we do. So see how that's stepped back, and now the edge of the zip tape, the zip is face down to the fabric, edge of the zip tape is against the edge of that seam we've just put in, and we're using our zip foot, and we're just running our zip foot along the edge of the zip teeth, and it'll automatically set that edge out about 2 millimeters or a shy an eighth of an inch, enough for the zip runner to run to and fro. Lots of row of stitches here, but don't worry about that because that's what it looks like. Don't be too concerned if you get any little pleats, they will be steamed out, they'll disappear. We want to now finish that edge. So what's going to happen is that we're going to actually trim just under that stitching we put in, and then we're going to fold our zip tape over and top stitch it down, and so the zip tape itself is going to encompass our raw seam so as it's nicely finished on the inside. So when that's put down and top stitched through, you will not see any raw stitching. We're doing that on the top and the bottom. Just make sure that my seams are nice and secure. And that was my tacking that I put in to show my centre back. We're going to run the edge of our foot along the edge of the teeth. Now you can't see my teeth here because I'm starting on the back where that sleeve or that loop is, but my foot is sewing along the edge of the teeth, and it will just keep our work nice and even. If you want to use an edge stitching foot or an edge guide foot, please do. You can get a special zip foot that has a tunnel on the side of it which runs against the edge of the teeth to keep it nice and even. Never used one of those myself, but I'm sure they would come in very handy if you were wanting it to be totally perfect. So I'm just running the edge of my foot along the edge of my teeth and making sure that zip tape is sitting flat and that trimmed seam allowance is sitting inside the zip tape underneath. You can pin that, you can give it a good firm press. You could even hand baste it if you wanted to. It really doesn't matter what you do as long as that, see, that's been caught. If I've missed a bit, then I will go back and actually just catch that again. There we go. That's what that's going to look like. And then we sit our lid inside the tray, which is turned out, so it's inside out. We're going to set our centre back onto our centre back and our centre front onto our centre front. Then pin it all the way around so as it's nice and even. And we're going to repeat the same process. We're going to stitch the zip in by having the zip foot against the edge of our teeth. And then we're going to trim our seam allowance back because we're putting this edge of our zip tape against the 1/4 inch stitching that we put in to reduce that seam allowance slightly, because we're using a number 3 zip. And we're going to, once that's all into position, I'm consistently starting at the beginning of my sleeve or loop that covers the zip. I just want to start at the same place each time. doesn't matter whether you do or not, or whether you don't, it doesn't matter. This is such a test on accuracy, because you really do have to be very firm with the project and also try and keep the foot against the teeth. And again, just want to trim that back so as that when that's all sitting flat, that will be stitched from the right side. So we can easily get into it by undoing our zip. And then once we'll undo our zip completely, and then we'll just do our last row of stitching so as our zip tab is flat and it is enveloping the seam allowance which we've trimmed back. Just take your time. You might have to push the zip out of the way several times during the process of putting the zip in, but it's not hard. Let me come to the very end. There's so much you could do for this little tote. You can make it in so many different ways. You can put different handles on it. You could put some side D-rings. You could put straps around from the base up to the zip line to give the tote more support. So many things you could do with it. The basic shape lends itself to being very, very usable in different ways. So, there we have it. The zip has encompassed all the seams. Needs a bit of a fluff up with some steam, just to steam those seams. But it's a fun project and I've really enjoyed doing it.